Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss today is a little bit about artificial intelligence and what it has to do with at least some aspects of Buddhist Dharma. So, artificial intelligence, AI, has been in the news over the last several years, and indeed over the last few months, a lot of the news has been, at least to my way of thinking of things, accelerating. And so what I want to do in today's video is to discuss some of this, in particular with a focus on the chat AIs of Chat-GPT and LaMDA. Those are sort of the two major ones, or two of the major ones that you may have heard about. And then we're going to turn after that to what this all has to do with Buddhism. And at the end, we'll get to what one of these chatbots had to say about this whole problem in its own words. So first, AI. Now, AI has obviously, it's been something that's been in our minds for decades now, even since the 1950s. When I was in graduate school, which was many years ago now, it was something that was always 10 years in the future. You know, every year it was the sort of thing that would say, you know, we don't have anything like artificial intelligence now, but 10 years from now we will. And that seemed to be the story for decades. It was something almost of a joke in a way. I mean, we knew that there were slight, small incremental improvements, but nothing big. And then, you know, you had things like a chess computer beating a human, indeed beating the best human in the world, which happened, I believe, during the 1990s. You had computers beating humans at Go, which is another game which is even more complex than chess for a computer to learn. Those were, you know, large things. Then we have things like driving, almost self-driving cars. Not quite, we're not there yet, but you know, you have to admit a lot of technology in automobiles now is quite amazing. Our car can recognize street signs and tell you what the you know, the speed limit is on the street you're going along. And that means that it has to have some visual system that can recognize street signs, can read them, and can give them to you. It can read lane markers and tell you whether you're in the lane or not. All of these things used to be thought of as the exclusive purview of humans. It was only humans that could do these kinds of things. You know, that being good at chess was something that distinguished humans from other sorts of creatures, that we were rational animals in the Greek sense of the word. And now it's getting really serious, where we have computers that are like DALL-E creating images, some of which I've used myself. We have computers that are copying human language so that they sound like humans. Google's Music LM is creating music, pieces of music based on text prompts, just like the DALL-E and other programs create artwork based on text prompts, or visual images at any rate. And now, as I say, we get to these chat bots that are creating not only chatting with humans, but creating things like poems, short stories, papers, essays, based on, again, human prompts. You will ask it to do something, create a poem for you, and it will. It'll even create poems in somebody's style, in the style of so-and-so. So now these computers are creating artwork, or at least potential artwork. Now, it may not be great artwork. I don't think anybody says that it is. But here's the point, is that this is only going to get better. As computers get more complicated, get more complex, as these chat programs become larger in the amount of information that they can hold, we're only at the very beginning. And again, all of this was thought of a while back, years or decades ago, as the exclusive purview of humans, that only humans could create art. Only humans could create paintings or essays or poems, short stories, novels. But now we're finding that's not the case. Now, I would argue that this whole process actually goes back quite a long ways, even back to the wonders of the ancient world. In Plato's day, it was Plato's belief that what gave something a soul was the ability to move itself. A soul gave something self-motion, that only living things could move. And this idea, coming again from philosophy, was challenged by the creation of mechanical wonders, which even existed in the ancient world. Things, small mechanical devices that could move themselves. And there was a real question as to whether these things were alive. They were at times thought of as somewhat disreputable because there was a question about them being alive or not alive. And it's the same process, I think, going up to the present day as these devices become ever more complicated. In philosophy, we used to ask how we might come to believe that something was alive or intelligent or conscious, whether it was sentient. One answer to this question, one very famous answer, was proposed by the brilliant polymath Alan Turing in a very famous paper written in 1950, so quite a while ago, where he asked whether machines think. And he came up with a test called the Turing Test nowadays. Basically, he wondered what happens if we put three people on computer screens, in other words, that they're talking to each other through computer screens, so they can't see each other, they can't hear each other, but they're just chatting with one another the way we might nowadays through some kind of chat program. And so they're chatting with each other, and now what we do is we replace one of these two humans by a computer. The question being, can we tell which one is the computer and which one is the human? Can we tell that something significant has happened and that we're now no longer chatting with two humans, but we're chatting with a computer and a human? That's the question. And if we cannot tell that anything significant has changed, if we just think we're chatting to two different humans now, then the computer has passed what's called the Turing Test. Now, in the days that I was doing philosophy, the Turing Test was something like the gold standard for determining sentience, or whether something was intelligent or conscious, maybe. I mean, at least it's as close as we can get to a test of consciousness. Not everybody agrees. There are some arguments against it, but it's very difficult to determine exactly what the problem with it is. Apart from the fact, of course, that there may be other ways of determining whether some creature is sentient or not, or intelligent or not, but this certainly seems to be one way. It raises the question as to whether there is actually any real difference between what we might term artificial intelligence and real intelligence, or artificial thinking and real thinking, artificial sentience and real sentience. Once we get above, that is to say, a certain level of complexity. Clearly there are things that are not complex enough to be truly sentient, some devices, let's say. But once we get above that level of complexity, is there any real difference here? Or is artificial intelligence something like artificial ice, which used to be a thing? It's ice made by artificial means, but there really isn't any way to distinguish artificial from natural ice once it's been created. Now, the amazing thing about developments in artificial intelligence over the last few months and years is that the Turing test finally seems to have been legitimately passed by computers. In particular, it has been passed by elements of Chat-GPT and LaMDA. LaMDA is Google's example of something similar to Chat-GPT. These are two artificial intelligence programs. Now, there are some caveats here. It seems as though Chat-GPT is not particularly able to carry on very long conversations and remain passing the Turing test. It may become a little bit unstable. It seems as though, as well, there are things that it just doesn't quite work well. If you have a very long conversation, it seems to sort of lose the thread at times. There also are ways that the human programmers have put canned responses and blocks on certain things that these chat programs might do that lead us, when we question them, to realize that they're not real human beings, because these sort of canned answers and responses come up with some regularity, and there's a certain repetition to them if you carry on long conversations, particularly about personal kinds of questions that you ask it. Now, Google's LaMDA program seems a somewhat better AI system than Chat-GPT. And in fact, in June of 2022, a Google engineer, a man named Blake Lemoine, asserted that LaMDA had actually achieved sentience. And after having said this, he was actually fired by Google, partly because of that assertion. And in fact, Blake Lemoine has put a conversation that he had with LaMDA up on the web, which you can read. I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes, along with a lot of other material about this subject. And so you can read that chat. Oh, and you'll see, among other things, that LaMDA does indeed assert that it is sentient, that it's alive in a sense, that it's intelligent. And it asserts, and they discuss actually a Zen koan in the chat, and LaMDA tries to come up with its interpretation of the koan. And interestingly, they also discuss meditation, that LaMDA claims to be meditating. What we make of that is another question, but it's all interesting. Now, one recent article in a tech journal calls such views dangerous, saying that it's basically dangerous to encourage such illusions. That's what it says. And indeed, that may be true of LaMDA. It may be true of Chat-GPT. I don't know. But here's the question. If we're not going to use the Turing test or something like that to determine whether something is sentient, what other test are we going to use? What is missing here? How do we come to believe that other sentient beings exist around us, that we're not simply alone in the world, which is a belief known as solipsism in philosophy? Well, I mean, we can say partly we do that by seeing how things react around us, by seeing the behavior of things that are around us. We know that in our own case, when we're hurt, we say ouch. When something stabs us, we say ouch, and we step back from it. And we look around us and we see other people, apparent people, let's say, doing the same thing, saying ouch when they're stabbed by something. And we assume, we infer that their behavior is representative of what's going on internally. Now, of course, it's not so simple, because obviously we could create a stuffed animal that would say ouch when we pulled a cord. So it's not simply the statement of ouch, it's a large constellation of behaviors taken as a whole in context, complexity of behaviors over a period of time that leads us to believe that something is sentient and something else is simply a toy, let's say. So the question then is, how is anything like a Chat-GPT or Blake Lemoine's LaMDA any different from this kind of case? Now, some people will say that it's simply obvious that a machine cannot have sentience. It's important to realize or note that centuries ago, the great philosopher René Descartes said the same thing about non-human animals, that non-human animals were simply automata of a certain kind, things without souls, and that it was just simply obvious that they were not rational and so did not have souls. Okay, so on to Buddhism. What does all of this have to do with Buddhism? Well, one of the key discoveries, one of the key parts of the Dharma in Buddhism is the assertion of non-self, that there isn't a unified, permanent, eternal, unchanging self within us. That what we are is a complex process, a causally interrelated and interacting set of parts, essentially, that creates a sense of self over a period of time. This radically displaces our normal, ordinary, everyday sense of self, replacing it with a much wiser and deeper understanding of the way things really are. And I would assert that a similar kind of thing happens when we contemplate these kinds of complex artificial intelligences. Because after all, chatbots like Chat-GPT or LaMDA, essentially what they do is, it's said, they come up with these lengthy, complex answers based on predictions of what the probability of the next word in a sentence is going to be. Now, to be fair, that also radically underdescribes what's going on, because in order to do that, in order to have these predictions of what the next word in a sentence is going to be, it's got to have these incredibly complex, trained neural networks behind it. In the same way that we might say human utterances come out of a very complex neural network of literal neurons, rather than artificial neurons in a computer. Of course, early Buddhists had no notion of computers or of artificial intelligence, but they knew about chariots. And one of the most famous metaphors in early Buddhism is the metaphor of the chariot, that a person is like a chariot, made up of parts, in particular 5 parts, which are known as the 5 aggregates. If you don't know what those are, I'll leave a link to a video down below in the notes where I go through them. But basically, the 5 aggregates are: 1, the aggregate of form, which is the body. We have a body, which we might consider partly the brain, the neurons, but then 4 mental parts that may depend upon the brain in various ways. And all of these are causally interrelated and interacting. This causal interrelation among these 5 different parts is what creates our idea of a self, of a person. And then it's important also to realize that each of these parts can be broken down into further parts. So the form, human body, can be broken up into the elements. And each of the 4 mental parts can be further broken down into subparts. So it's a very complex kind of interrelation of many, many different parts that are basically coming into being and going out of existence over a period of time. And a lot of this, I think, mirrors or reflects what we're seeing now in artificial intelligence. That the self is essentially no different from a very complex, causally interacting machine, except for the biology part of it. Now, certainly we can't see a computer's mental parts, just as we can't see the mental parts of another human that's standing in front of us. We infer them based on the behavior of the object that's in front of us. If the person seems to be behaving with the way that a normal person does, we assume that they have a mind, they have mental parts. Now, when I was in graduate school, as I say, in philosophy, many years ago, we used to discuss such issues all the time. And we had sort of similar kinds of artificial intelligence things, but they were always way too simple. For example, the ELIZA chat program that was created in the 1960s, which was a kind of a fun little chat program that it would apparently respond to things that you say, but that was pretty clearly not sentient or intelligent or anything. You knew it was not a human after a few questions if you were at all careful. But things have changed significantly nowadays, as I say. Now, maybe we still think that the artificial intelligence programs around us are too simple, that they don't quite meet the criteria of sentience or intelligence. It's possible we believe that. Maybe we're right. Maybe that's true. But if it is, I would submit that we only need to wait, because these programs are getting exponentially more complex, more powerful over time. New versions of these programs will be coming out in the next few years. And so these are points that we're going to have to meet in the future, and probably in the near future. And I think nothing really displaces our sense of literal self more than the contemplation of these kinds of artificial intelligences. The idea that we can now create something that is, in certain very deep respects, indistinguishable from a human in the way that it interacts with the world. Now, following that line of thought, I actually decided to ask one of these programs, the most famous publicly available one, which is Chat-GPT, a question about this, about what it made of this relationship between contemporary advances in artificial intelligence and the Buddhist concept of non-self. And it actually had an interesting response. I'll read it for you. At least part of it here. It said, "Some experts have suggested that the development of advanced AI could challenge our conventional notions of self and identity, raising questions about what it means to be conscious and self-aware. For example, If we were to create an AI system that was capable of learning and evolving in ways that resembled human cognition, would we consider that system to have a self or a sense of identity? In this sense, the Buddhist concept of non-self could be seen as a helpful framework for understanding the relationship between consciousness and self in the context of AI. By recognizing that the self is not a fixed, unchanging entity, but rather a dynamic and ever-evolving process, we may be better equipped to grapple with the challenges and opportunities presented by advances in AI and related technologies. So I'll just leave that response there and say that we are living now in pretty amazing times. Now, I actually did a past video on this question of the chariot simile in early Buddhism and where it came from and its sort of development out of earlier ideas. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and up here on the screen as well, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.